Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the greatest thinkers and most powerful figures in history. Athens, the cradle of democracy, justice, and liberty. Greco-Roman antiquity, the foundation of Western civilization. Right? Well, Kramer Anthony Appiah, professor of philosophy and law at NYU, would argue, no. In his essay titled, "There is no such thing as Western civilization," Appiah argues that there is no real connection between antiquity and the contemporary Western world other than the ones we fabricate. He maintains that the term Western culture is surprisingly modern. The very idea of the West doesn't really emerge until the 1890s during the heated era of imperialism and gains broader currency only in the 20th century. Appiah also brings up the fact that the West is really an arbitrary term that geographically lumps a whole lot of extremely different societies together, while delicately carving around Australians and New Zealanders and white South Africans so that Western here can look simply like a euphemism for white. Appiah asserts that Western society treats classical antiquity as a golden nugget, meaning that it is something precious that must be protected and preserved in order to be passed on to future generations. Classical antiquity has had a profound effect on art for centuries. The Renaissance, arguably the most influential and innovative period of art history, means rebirth, literally the rebirth and revitalization of ancient Greco-Roman art and characteristics. Renaissance artists imitated the classical focus on anatomy and the heroic nude, and established the ideal beauty as having a pallor very reminiscent of the pristine white of ancient Roman statues made of marble. A lot of Renaissance art also depicted scenes from Greco-Roman mythology, sometimes even incorporating mythical figures into Christian art because they were so recognizable. For centuries, we have associated characteristics of antiquity with education, intelligence, power, authority, strength, and recently, democracy. The United States is widely recognized as the first modern democracy, modeled after the first ever true democracy, Athens. The way American architecture has been classicized, specifically architecture of government buildings, and statues and figures of American history, illustrates the way the United States has used association with classical imagery and ideals to create an identity of a strong country and a just democracy. The White House and the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. both exemplify many of the characteristics of ancient Greco-Roman temples, similar to the Parthenon in Athens, Greece. In addition to this, the U.S. Capitol also features an enormous dome akin to the dome at the Pantheon in Rome. John Levy Barnard, Associate Professor of Comparative and World Literature at the University of Illinois, wrote in his book titled Empire of Ruin, Black Classicism and American Imperial Culture, that monumentalism, an aesthetic and historiographical practice, most obviously manifested in the construction of actual buildings and monuments, supports the work of nation building by creating, through manipulation of a mythical past, a feeling of national belonging. Throughout U.S. history, classicism and monumental culture have performed precisely this kind of work, contributing to the ideological underpinnings of the Revolutionary War and the nation's founding, providing sites at which to cultivate a collective national identity through historical commemoration and legitimating and authorizing an expansive imperial project by matching the millennial religiosity of manifest destiny with a sense of secular purpose. Through identification with the precedents of Greece and especially Rome, American writers, artists, and political leaders could figure the United States as the inheritor of the best traditions of classical antiquity, whether as a new republic or what Thomas Jefferson would call an empire for liberty, and thus as the standard bearer for the idea of civilization itself. He maintains that the United States has a long and ongoing tradition of appropriating classical history and literature to the narrative of the exceptional progress and the manifest destiny of the American nation. As an example of this monumentalism, he notes the historical distortions and elisions, most notably the absence of images of slavery and civil war, that characterize the architecture and interior design of the Capitol. The United States was built on slavery. It was the reason the US was able to grow a strong economy and society, and so quickly. Within less than 200 years, the United States grew from 13 small colonies to 2/3 of the global superpower that it is today, with a thriving agricultural economy in the South and a quickly urbanizing North. The bloodiest war in American history still remains the Civil War, which almost tore the country apart permanently. The Jim Crow laws that followed were a direct result of the ensuing racism that persisted in the South as white supremacists attempted to maintain the hierarchy and oppression that existed with slavery. The complete absence of slavery and the Civil War in all the artwork in the U.S. Capitol is an erasure of a very prominent part of U.S. history for the sake of putting forward a clean image of a strong country that was built on the intelligence and hard work of the white men depicted in most of the artwork: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Marquis de Lafayette, rather than the enslavement and abuse of African Americans. The artwork within the Capitol focuses on key moments and events of American history. The paintings and murals feature scenes from the European exploration and discovery of the New World, Revolutionary War, villainizing Britain, the creation of foundational documents such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and the first congressional meetings. These are key foundational moments in U.S. history, but they are far from telling the whole story. Not only do they completely ignore the history of slavery and abuse and the long-lasting and violent conflict within the country that this led to, but they also idolize and glorify figures such as Christopher Columbus, who murdered and enslaved thousands of Native Americans, forcing them off of their own land and colonizing them, and the rest of our founding fathers, most of whom were also slaveholders. The statues in the U.S. Capitol are also very reminiscent of the bronze and marble statues of ancient Greek and Roman political and military leaders. The orator, for instance, an ancient Greek statue made of bronze meant to represent a Greek politician addressing a crowd, is remarkably similar to the bronze statue of President Andrew Jackson, who forcibly displaced approximately 60,000 Native Americans from their homelands in the Trail of Tears. So many Native Americans died during this journey from exposure, starvation, and disease that some historians consider the Trail of Tears a genocide. Figures like Andrew Jackson are literally placed on a pedestal in the artwork in the Capitol. The political image of the United States is and always has been heavily reliant on the general perception of classical antiquity to present something that is strong and builds its foundation on a fair and just Athenian democracy that treats all of its citizens equally. This statue of Confederate soldier General Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, was erected in 1924, 59 years after the end of the Civil War. It emulates perfectly the ancient Roman equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. These Confederate statues have been a topic of debate for the past several years, since approximately 2015 after the mass shooting of 9 African Americans at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. These statues classicize and glorify soldiers who fought for the right to own slaves in order to intimidate and oppress Black Americans decades after the Civil War. Not only that, but they were commissioned and installed in an attempt to erase and rewrite the outcome and aftermath of the Civil War and to instill fear and obedience in the hearts of Black Americans. In May 2020, after the murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin, Black Lives Matter protesters spray-painted several of these Confederate statues on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, defacing them in order to express the fact that they have remained standing for nearly a century as a symbol of racism and oppression that white supremacists erected as part of a movement after the Civil War to retain the sense of control over African Americans that existed during slavery. In 2020, after the death of George Floyd sparked outrage across the country and these disputes over Confederate statues boiled over, 157 Confederate memorials were removed across the country. Many remained, however, including the statues on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, where the infamous Robert E. Lee statue resides. Being such well-known landmarks in the city that used to be the capital of the Confederacy, these statues have been directly in the spotlight during the debate surrounding the removal of controversial statues. Richmond-based artists Dustin Klein and Alex Kriege created a light show they titled Reclaiming the Monument, which they projected onto the Confederate statues at night.
It was my intention to work among the 22 million non-Muslim Afro-Americans and to try and form some type of organization or create a situation where the young people, our young people, the students and others, could study the problems of our people for a period of time and then come up with a new analysis and give us some new ideas and some new suggestions as to...
In July 2020, most of the Confederate statues on Monument Avenue were removed. On September 8, 2021, the Robert E. Lee Monument was finally removed by the Commonwealth of Virginia. So far, there has been no unified decision of what is to happen to these statues. United States history is full of, as Barnard says, appropriation of classical tradition to an American imperial culture. This is only a fraction of the many ways America has appropriated classical tradition, or more accurately, the 19th century perception of what classical tradition was. The classical image is inextricably entwined with the American image and is used to glorify controversial figures. That's why it's important to examine these appropriations and demystify them. We have to understand that American tradition is not a perfect and precious golden nugget, and that these works of art represent the version of history written by men who believed they were the sole inheritors of classical tradition. The image and reputation presented through these famous monuments and artworks are not accurate depictions of American history or classical history. Deconstructing the way American political art has appropriated classical culture to put forward a very manufactured image is the only way we can uncover and remember the full extent of the history behind the facade.